Hello and welcome to this video on the birth of scientific criminology for the criminology class. We're going to talk briefly about the historical context, though we're going to do this in a very broad, sweeping historical brush. Very broad, because we're really talking about 800 years um, of, of context that we need to discuss. So let's talk about the plague, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. Most of us know about the Black Death or the plague that killed so many people worldwide. It was a worldwide pandemic and tragedy. Um, Millions died during the plague. When the plague ended, we got the Renaissance, actually. The Renaissance was born from the plague. Now, during the Renaissance, we had artists like Botticelli painting the birth of Venus. Now, I put this painting up here with Botticelli instead of a Leonardo da Vinci or a Michelangelo because Botticelli, Botticelli's name is not as remembered by students as Leonardo and Michelangelo were. So that's why I use Botticelli. But the Renaissance. But when we think about the Renaissance, we talk about the Renaissance man. Well, because of the place of women in society at the time, which was not the best place, but women were less able to do what men were able to do because of cultural mores of the time. So we talk about the Renaissance man, but I would prefer to use the term Renaissance person to include all genders. The idea of the Renaissance person is that they are artistic, they love art, but they also are well read, but they also are very scientific. We could look at the journals of Leonardo and see the scientific and engineering that he designed. So very important to understand that the Renaissance was born out of the plague. When a very tragic worldwide pandemic occurred, when it ended, we got a new birth of creativity and academic pursuit. And from that was born the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is more of a philosophical than a scientific movement. But at the same time, it enabled us to be where we are today with science as well. The Enlightenment is when the Renaissance people began to realize that there are certain things that we need to address in our society. For example, the enslavement of human beings. That was a very important part of the Enlightenment. Now, I don't have slides on this, but we could look at William Wilberforce in England. We could fast forward to Alexander Campbell, who is a native West Virginian, founder of Bethany College, who communicated with Wilberforce when he was younger and Wilberforce was older, and then was also an abolitionist. So we could look at some of these areas of the Enlightenment, but the American Revolution was born from the Enlightenment. So that revolution is based on the idea of democracy, but also the republic. So the United States is not a democracy, it is a democratic republic. Now, the idea of a democratic republic is that individuals have rights, and that part of what the government is supposed to do is protect the rights of the individual. Hence, the U.S. Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, to ensure that the government could not violate the rights of its citizens. But with the Enlightenment, this all became possible because of the printing press. Okay, so you can see the printing press right here. That is a replica, but so you see a replica of the printing press. You see an etching of a printing press operation, um, printing books. So what happened with the printing press is that books became easier to copy. Now, prior to this, the way that books were manufactured were that a reader would be in the front of a room, and the room would be full of 20 to 30 scribes, sometimes even more, depending on how much production was needed at the time. And that reader would read the text, and the scribes, the 20 to 30 people in the room, would write what was being read. So you can see how very, very expensive that was. So only the wealthy at that point were able to purchase books because they were so expensive in comparison to the way they are now. You might think they're expensive now, but that textbook that might cost $200 now, back then would cost the equivalent of $1,000 now. So just something to keep in mind. But what happened with the advent of the printing press and books becoming more common is that no longer was literacy something for the wealthy, but it was something for the common man as well. The commoner could begin to read. So what ended up happening is that Martin Luther would write his 95 Theses, hammer them to the door in Wittenberg, and the Protestant Reformation was born from the ability to read. Because as the common person began to read the Bible for themselves, they would see that it didn't include what Catholic theology at the time, and it has changed in large part because of the Reformation. But the average person could read the Bible and see that there were certain things that were not in there, or that it was different than what they were being told. They learned that they did not have to pay for indulgences in order to get out of purgatory and go to heaven. They began to learn about the forgiveness of God. So that's something that became very important. If you did not know, reading was the first act of social justice. So if you don't like to read, if people tell you that reading is for those intellectual folks and I don't need to read to make a living, what they are doing and what you are doing to yourself if you believe that is you're keeping yourself uninformed. You're giving other people power over you. Okay, I'm going to move on from that aside. All right, so during the Enlightenment, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing a book called The Social Contract. Now, the social contract was a political theory that was already in vogue. Rousseau simply wrote the book by the title, expounding the theory. It's not the only book, but it is the most well-known of the social contract writings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau begins the book. So I want to read the very first line of chapter 1. Now, in his book, he has an introduction to book 1. It's just 3 paragraphs. And then you move to chapter 1, the subject of the book. That's the name of chapter 1. And this is what he writes, the very first words of chapter 1, the subject of the book. Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains. Those who think themselves the masters of others are indeed greater slaves than they. Wow. So, in short, the social contract is a political theory that says that individual citizens are willing to give up more and more of their freedoms um, so that the state can protect them. In other words, they're feeling safe by giving up their freedoms. Now, the founders of the United States um, threw off that idea. Um, not Thomas Jefferson, but Benjamin Franklin um, is purported to have made the point that um, a society that would give up freedom to feel safe desires neither freedom nor safety, which is an interesting concept. Now, those aren't his exact words, but that's kind of the point that he was making. So the founders of the U.S. kind of threw off this idea of the social contract. However, most Europeans accepted the social contract at that point in time. So it's important to understand the social contract, but the social contract did not have as much influence on philosophic criminology, the early scientific criminology, as did utilitarianism. So when we get to utilitarianism and the pleasure principle, we have to talk about John Stuart Mill. However, it's important to understand that John Stuart Mill wrote his work titled Utilitarianism. And again, he did not name the theory. He simply wrote the book about the theory. And he wrote this book about the theory long after it had become a primary ethical political theory. Now, here's the thing. At the time that he wrote utilitarianism, he felt that he needed to defend the theory. So it was beginning to come under attack at that point. So utilitarianism and the pleasure principle. So let's start with utilitarianism as an ethical principle. Utilitarianism claims that the ethical choice is the choice of the greater good. So you see here a train that is barreling down the tracks, and there is a person at the switch who can change the direction of the train. So which way should he make the train go? He doesn't have a good choice either way. No matter which way the train goes, someone is going to die. Utilitarianism says that the train should be switched to where it kills the fewest number of people. So in this case, the switchman would change the direction of the train so that it kills the one instead of the five. So this is called the greatest good principle. If you're taking notes, write that down. If you're not taking notes, start taking notes and write that down. The greatest good principle. But there's another part of utilitarianism that is more individualistic, and that is the pleasure principle. Okay, so the pleasure principle basically says that human beings, and this is part of utilitarian theory, that basically says that human beings seek to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. In other words, an individualized greatest good principle. So that when we make choices either consciously or subconsciously based on whether we believe they will provide us an increased pleasure, a decreased pain, or both. So that's the pleasure principle born out of utilitarian theory. So the social contract is that the rights of the individual should be protected. The individual is important. And then utilitarianism, the greatest good principle, that while the individual is important, We also need to understand that we've got to make the choices that protect the greatest number of individuals. So, interesting concepts that were popular around the same time, but at the same time that Cesare Beccaria, whom we're going to discuss in a later video, um, applied to his philosophical theory of criminology. I'm going to stop the share and say that this video has probably been a little longer than I wanted it to, but it's important that you understand these concepts, um, and that you also begin to look at how a lot of these concepts were um, contradictory. They had limits to them. There was a lot of confidence in them at the time, and there are those who today have a lot of confidence in these theories. That in the end, there are some flaws to them, and I wanted to point out some of those flaws. Now, you may argue against those flaws that I pointed out, and that's fine. That is fine. That is what academics are all about. Healthy disagreements. We will see you next video.